Hello and welcome to the daily update. Back here again in the fallout from the worst coup since the Turkey 2016 one, and it didn't even get as far as that. So we'll discuss the aftermath of Prigozhin's, well, whatever the hell it was, in just a moment. But first, we'll look at what's actually been going on in terms of the war in Ukraine. And of course, this has been somewhat neglected over the past couple of days. But the big thing to say is that, of course, very little has actually happened. For all the excitement that the Prigozhin gambit, or again, whatever it was, generated inside the governing circles of the West, the actual reality of the battlefield remained largely the same. There was claims that there was going to be some big Ukrainian breakthrough in the Zaporozhye front, and nothing really materialized of any substance anyway. And so the current way in which we should see this is that, of course, the impact of the Prigozhin, events had very little actual bearing on the battlefield inside Ukraine itself. And the offensive that is now almost a month old, that is the Ukrainian offensive that was talked about constantly for 6 months, has continued on with great losses. According to one Russian source, there was over 500 casualties for the armed forces of Ukraine just yesterday on the Zaporozhye front. So we are looking at a situation where the losses for Ukraine continue to be devastating, and where the actual reality of the situation is that the Russians continue to make good on their promise of a solid defense, and the Ukrainians continue to dash themselves to death, quite literally, against it. So whatever Zelensky or his handlers might have hoped to get out of whatever happened in Russia recently over the last weekend, it hasn't emerged as yet. And today we got further news that in actual fact the Russian mobilization, i.e. not a forced mobilization but a self-mobilization, continues. Now, again, this is according to Russian sources, but there are currently, according to Russian Ministry of Defense and other sources in Russia, a rate of new joiners of the Russian armed forces of 1,300 new professionals signing on each day, many of them with some military experience, but also those who are completely new to military life. And that the Russians are now looking at a situation where they can build up a force over the course of this year of new soldiers that will total 400,000 if the current rate of recruitment continues. And so they're currently, though, in a situation where they could have at least 3 to 4 army corps that would be available for a potential counterattack when the Ukrainian offensive stumbles and falls and finally peters out. So whilst the dramatics have been going on with Prigozhin, the Russian armed forces have continued a very high level of recruitment over the course of the year, and will be in a position to have a force that could well be, again, by the end of this year, in excess of 1 million men, if the number of 400,000 new soldiers is accurate. And they've already got around about 500,000, and of course there's more and more volunteers coming in constantly. So militarily speaking, not only did the attempted coup yesterday fail to damage Russia politically in any major way, the armed forces continue to strengthen. So when this offensive of the Ukrainians does finally run out of steam, the Russians are in a position where they can actually go on the offensive. And this only is going to strengthen as time goes on in terms of the availability of the Russians' heavy reinforcements. So no good news for the NATO side, in essence, on the military front, which they would have desperately wanted. And of course, we head rapidly towards the middle of July, which is where there'll be the NATO summit in Vilnius, where there'll be an awful lot of arguing and some token gestures made, I would anticipate. And bear in mind what I've been saying all the way along here, which is that the one thing that the NATO countries can actually agree on is doing something to prop Ukraine up for another month or so, just to hope that they continue to spin out the war in the hope that something comes up, i.e. destabilization inside the Russian Federation. And that brings us back, of course, to Mr. Prigozhin and his supposed coup, because that will have excited the intelligence men in NATO, particularly the US and the British, into thinking that, well, something could be going on inside the Russian Federation. And therefore, we need to continue the war. We need to spin things out further. We need to make sure that Ukraine continues to stagger onwards, regardless of the casualties and regardless of the cost. Now, recently, and this has been reported by John Helmer on his website, Dances with Bears, the Russian Federation, through Putin and also Zakharova, announced essentially that there has been a change in Russian intentions. And that came from a statement made by Maria Zakharova recently, where she made the observation that the mutual recognition treaties that had existed between the Russian Federation and Ukraine had actually been cancelled by Zelensky's government in 2019. Now, there's several mutual recognition treaties, two major ones. One that was signed between the Russian SFSR, Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, in 1991, and the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, also in 1991. These treaties were recognition of the fact that basically they were breaking up the Soviet Union, that it was no longer going to be one country, and this was going to be a new independent state of Ukraine and independent state of Russia recognizing each other. This was followed on in 1997 by a treaty that was signed between Leonid Kuchma, the president of Ukraine at the time, and Yeltsin, mutually recognizing each other's borders. These were withdrawn and trashed by Poroshenko and Zelensky. So essentially now, no recognition treaty exists between the government of Ukraine and the government of the Russian Federation. The Ukrainians have arbitrarily withdrawn from them already before the war, or more accurately, before the special military operation even began. So that is an interesting thing for a major Russian government spokeswoman to emphasize, and makes me wonder what they're going to do with that. And Putin himself now said that he's leaving the management of the special military operation purely to the military. I don't think that's strictly true, but that this is going to be essentially fought to a military conclusion, and that there will be no military presence left in Ukraine, and there'll be no NATO presence left in Ukraine. And all the hints that we were getting before the Prigozhin events indicate that the consensus within the Russian Federation government is that they were going to push further, and essentially that it's more likely than not now that the current Ukrainian state is going to be brought to an end. And this has probably been the only realistic outcome since Zelensky, again, on the instructions of Biden and Johnson, walked out of those peace talks with the Russians and ripped up the agreement over a year ago. At that moment, really, there was only going to be one outcome. As long as Zelensky and the Maidan regime remained in power and the West could prop them up, this war would continue. If Zelensky tried to stop the war, the protection, in inverted commas, that the British and the Americans were offering him against his own ultras, his own ultra fascists in the Azov and other groups, would be withdrawn, and Zelensky would be at risk of being killed. So he's going to push this as far as he possibly can, because really, other than going and surrendering to the Russians, which I don't think he's really on his agenda, Zelensky's only way to that villa in Miami is via the assistance of the US imperialists and the British. There's no other way out for him. He's going to keep this thing going as long as his masters order him to, which is basically meaning that the stage is already set for the destruction of the Ukrainian state in its entirety. So these are, of course, conclusions which are rather grim, because it means that the war will have to be pushed to the point where the Ukrainian state actually collapses. And we know how much the Americans really care about Ukrainian lives, which is that they don't at all. So again, to re-emphasize the point, the American imperialists need this war to go on as long as possible. The events involving Prigozhin will have only encouraged them to go even further, to keep the war spinning in the hope that something else will pop up inside Russia. I don't really think that it will, but I'll come to those details in a moment. And they'll keep this war going up to and beyond the point where the Ukrainian state simply collapses, because in all likelihood, Zelensky and his inner circle will flee, and you'll end up with some Ukrainian military commander, the last man standing, having to sign a surrender. But even then, of course, the Americans won't stop, because they'll just continue to do what Hillary Clinton promised they would do over a year ago, which is that they would run an insurgency in any area that the Russians took over, again, in the hope of eventually destabilizing the government of the Russian Federation. So this is the road that we are on now. It only ends with the destruction of the Ukrainian state, and whatever results will arise in Ukraine is going to be largely dependent upon the decisions made in Moscow. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, will the Poles get involved, will the Romanians get involved? And I will re-emphasize my point here, which is that I don't think that the Poles or Romanians or any other NATO army, especially not the Eastern European states, which are very weak, do not mistake the headline GDP figures of Poland for economic strength. The Polish capitalist economy has benefited an awful lot from heavily subsidized actions carried out by the European Union. One of the reasons why the Polish reactionaries, for all their tiffs with the German bourgeoisie, will not leave the EU. They gain a lot financially from it, more so than many of the other European Union nations in the East and Central Europe. So they don't have, in my view, the industrial capacity or the military capacity to go and fight a war against the Russians. Neither do the Romanians. I mean, Romania is a very weak capitalist state, mired in political instability and corruption scandals, and the connection it has with the masses in Romania is very, very weak, as it is with all of these states, and indeed is the case with the Western imperialist powers themselves. And as one observer on Twitter pointed out, even if the Americans pulled all of their troops from all of their military bases across their garrisons across the world, they could still only come up with a fighting force of around about 250,000. Now, if we already take as read that the Russians have 500,000 or so at least ready to go now, that they have at least another 400,000 coming their way before the end of the year, that after this Ukrainian offensive is over, they could have 600,000 to possibly 700,000 men available, then whatever the Poles or Romanians can throw into the mix isn't going to be enough when, again, the Ukrainians are already alleged to have lost 10,000 men. This Ukrainian army that they've built up rapidly and in a cheapskating fashion and by cutting every training corner is going to be destroyed pretty soon. So what, are they going to send a few thousand Poles, a few thousand Romanians to do what? To dare the Russians to attack it and see if Article 5 gets triggered? Well, even then, if Article 5 gets triggered, then what can the Americans do to bring in all these men that they would need to actually stand a chance of beating the Russians in the field? So none of this makes any sense other than as a game of brinksmanship dreamed up by somebody who has no concept of what these Eastern European states are actually capable of, and actually little concept of what the Western European states are capable of as well. The French and the Germans and the British might have a core of well-trained soldiers, but that's not enough against now a Russian army which has been battle-tested for many, many months, and many of them have been battle-tested for years. Some of them have been battle-tested for almost a decade. So there's not a lot that makes a good degree of sense here. The only real plausible way to victory for the NATO powers, for the US imperialists and their allies, was to have happen in Russia exactly what they thought was happening with Prigozhin, which is instability and collapse triggered by some sort of internal coup, some sort of coup amongst the Russian elites. Now, this brings me rather neatly to the Prigozhin situation and, of course, what has gone on over the past 48 hours or so. And that relates, of course, to the fact that Prigozhin seems to have now fled or gone into some sort of exile. Temporarily, it would seem, in Belarus. There are a lot of rumors circulating about the fact that he might be moving on from there to somewhere well outside of the current field of operations. outside of Russia, outside of the former Soviet bloc, perhaps somewhere in the African nations that would take him and basically put him in there as a political prisoner, somebody to be held and watched until he can be properly disposed of in the future. So does then raise the question again of, well, what the hell happened over the past couple of days? Because one thing that is certain is that whatever it was that Prigozhin thought he was doing, it attracted no support from any of the serious members of the political hierarchy that surround Putin. Nobody in there came out and offered any support to him. No military commander offered any support. He didn't even have the support, apparently, according to a piece by John Helmer, of the officer corps of Wagner itself. So the men who actually do the battle planning and actually do the running of the military side of Wagner, because remember, Prigozhin is just a front man, essentially a cheerleader, a man who goes out and trolls people on behalf of the Russians. And he, according to Russian sources here, attracted no more than, 4,000 men to support him, mainly from the rank and file of the Wagner organization. The officer corps and the people who make the serious decisions in Wagner were not involved in it. So what the hell did Prigozhin think he was going to get out of this, given that he had no support in the political hierarchy, no support in the military hierarchy? He didn't even have the support of the officers of the Wagner organization, and he got nothing out of the opposition parties, the major opposition parties in Russia, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and the Liberal Democratic Party. So what was he thinking he was going to get? Does rather beg the question. Now that, of course, brings us into the realm of pure speculation, which I don't want to spend too much time on, but if it is true that what the American imperialists are now claiming, that they knew that this was going to happen months ago, now you can claim that you knew something was going to happen when it's already happened. That's a rather easy claim to make. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to draw viewers' attention to. One of which is that there's been rabid speculation in the British press, particularly those who are very close to British intelligence services, particularly the Telegraph, that there was various characters were considering some sort of coup. The Telegraph, and I believe this made it into the Times as well, last August, was talking about how Prigozhin and Kadyrov and Surovikin were going to lead a coup to dispose of Gerasimov and Shoigu. Now, it's been my thoughts for a while on that this was just British intelligence essentially reading telegram channels from the Russian Duma faction. And I don't mean Duma in terms of parliament, I mean Duma in terms of we're all doomed faction, and extrapolating from that and engaging in a lot of wishful thinking. And that certainly seems to be what they do when it comes to a lot of the so-called intelligence work involving the Russian Federation. Now, when thinking further about this and thinking about what Prigozhin was doing, it's clear that he had no support personally, and that his attempts here petered out very quickly, went nowhere. And when it became obvious that he had nothing, he surrendered effectively to Lukashenko and went off into hiding out in a dacha somewhere in the Belarusian forests. But this does raise the question of, well, was he the intended beneficiary of all of this? Because for someone to actually destabilize the state, it doesn't have to be the case that they are the active traitor in doing so. Somebody can act to destabilize the state and not be the beneficiary of it. They can be somebody who has got their own reasons, who wants to carry out their own program, but who is actually only wittingly or otherwise acting on behalf of another faction that's waiting in the wings somewhere. So it may not have been the case that Prigozhin was the pawn of British intelligence or the Americans. It may have been the case, though, that certain other people inside Russia were. Again, this is speculation. We can certainly assume that, well, it's not an assumption. We know very well that the British and the American intelligence agencies work incredibly hard to recruit people inside certainly the Russian ruling class and inside key positions in particularly the west of Russia. So that they would be working overtime to try and make something happen or exploit something is fairly certain. But it all seems rather bizarre, given that nobody stepped forward to support Prigozhin at all. Did he think he was going to get some more support than he actually did? Or is he just a man whose ego and madness has run away with him and he actually didn't know what the hell he was doing? Perhaps he was egged on by somebody else. Again, only time will tell on this particular calculation. One thing is certain, though, which is that the idea of this being some kind of genius psychological operation is, frankly, a stupid one. Now, I have to admit some error here myself, because I thought that Prigozhin's outbursts during the siege of Artemovsk or Bakhmut a few months ago were part of some kind of manipulation operation on the Ukrainians to try and get them to send more men in. Now, I kept assuming that that's what he was doing, but certainly going this far and, again, setting in motion a chain of events like this is not some kind of genius psychological operation, and I will explain my reasons why I think that. To do something like this, even though Prigozhin doesn't appear to have had a great deal of support, even amongst the Wagner organization, to send troops on the road to Moscow to stage what appeared at least to be a takeover of a major town with a Russian military headquarters inside of it, and to do all this invites a certain degree of chaos to follow. And it wouldn't have taken all that much for that Wagner column and the Russian armed forces to get involved in a shooting war with each other. And indeed, it was the case that there have been reports that several airmen died in helicopters that were shot down following exchanges of fire with the Wagner forces. That's been confirmed now. So if those who think that this is some kind of genius psychological operation, I think are divorced from reality now. Because once you start this chain of events in progress, you are not guaranteed to get the result that you want, no matter how clever you think your plan is. For instance, if suddenly there's exchanges of fire between the Wagner organization and Russian armed forces, your psychological operation, to root out the traitors, as some would put it, suddenly turns into a major shooting war, and you've got a major problem then behind the lines. And to say that, oh, well, would have been all under control, you can't control these things like that. If you just look at the history of warfare and look at how many times some ruler or some intelligence man has had a very clever genius plan over some limited maneuver, some provocation that was bound to lead to a positive result, that was bound to uncover the traitors, and it actually leads to a major catastrophe. So I reject this idea that this was all some incredibly clever psyop. Whatever it wasn't that. Whatever it was, it certainly didn't attract any of the support that Prigozhin might have wanted. So we will not know for sure exactly what it was or who was involved for many, many months, though we should really keep an eye out for stories of arrests or sudden resignations. But for now, all we know is that it didn't attract any support, and it didn't weaken the Russians, particularly on the battlefield, given that the Ukrainians continue to fail in their now month-long offensive. And judging from the British media response today, the bourgeois press here are completely puzzled by what the hell has gone on. So whatever it is, the British official sources are as puzzled by it as anybody else is. Pausing now to look at potential questions. So, what do we have here? A request to turn up the volume from Peter. Let me have a look at that. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll have a look at that for tomorrow, because trying to do technical adjustments on the fly isn't exactly something I can do at the moment. So, question from Chris Luna. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but why has communism never worked? And we are taught this from history. Well, it is an incorrect assessment. The communist states or socialist states have achieved an awful lot. I mean, if you look at the industrialization process in the Soviet Union, to go from being a backward agrarian economy to being a economy that could compete with and indeed in the end outperform the most industrialized country in Europe in the form of Nazi Germany, that is an achievement that could not have been obtained by degenerate Russian capitalism. And also, just look at what even a country that has been under siege for years, like Cuba, has achieved in terms of its public health system, in terms of the medical achievements that it's carried out, in terms also of the achievements in mass literacy that communist countries have carried through. In places like China, of course, and in places like the DPRK, which is often written off in Western propaganda as some kind of starving hermit kingdom, I believe is the phrase that is used a lot. But in actual fact has industrialized heavily and become self-sufficient in agriculture in a way that, again, a capitalist Korea could not have done. And it has true independence, which South Korea certainly doesn't. So when people say, "Oh, communism doesn't work," well, you need to actually look at the communist states that still exist and have existed in the past. The planned economies of those nations have achieved remarkable feats in, as I said, industrialization, self-sufficiency in agriculture, education of the population, the bringing of the population into political decision-making in a way that has never been done under capitalism. And I will expand upon this at greater length in future live streams. So, right, there's now an argument over communism in the chat, but certainly China still has a planned economy. To a certain extent, there are capitalist elements in there, but if we get into that, I'll be here all night. But the essential point to make about China is that they managed to carry out their industrialization to the point where they could have these enormous growth rates all before 1976. And again, they achieved great things in terms of the technical level of education of the population. They had a far better educated population far quickly than we did in Britain. And to this day, they continue to achieve things thanks to the planned elements of their economy, like their anti-poverty drive, for instance. Am I seriously saying that North Korea is more developed than South Korea? South Korea is very well developed in certain areas where the Americans want it to be developed, such as the microprocessor industry and the car industry. But North Korea is a very well developed nation. They have their own space satellite program. They have their own nuclear weapons program. You don't get all of that whilst being poverty stricken. And I think you'll find that what South Korea's got in terms of development is the kind of development the Americans wanted them to have, not the kind of well-rounded development that the North has. Now, when I will admit that I made errors about the DPRK and the judgments about it because I was ignorant about it. We're encouraged to be ignorant about it. I would encourage Chris to go and go away and read something on the DPRK. You can easily find stuff all over the place. There's a very good Reddit thread, for instance, on debunking anti-communist talking points, which I will drop into the chat there. So don't believe what you hear about communist countries from the media. If you make the assumption that the media in Britain and the United States lies about everything, which they do, well, they especially lie about communist countries because they don't want people to know of the actual achievements of these nations. And yes, President Jesus is right. Up to the 80s, the DPRK was more developed than South Korea, and I would argue it has a more even rate of industrial development now. Life in South Korea is actually pretty hellish. If you look at the amount of working hours there, the fact that in South Korea the birth rate is far below the DPRK because life there is miserable and alienated for most of the population. In fact, take all the things that are said about the DPRK and apply it to South Korea and you have actually a more accurate picture. A couple of other things I wanted to mention on this stream was that, of course, Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, has been in Washington, D.C. recently, meeting with old Dementia Joe. And, of course, he made some headlines because he appeared to agree with Biden about Ukraine, saying, "Oh yes, yeah, we must have peace, and Ukrainian territorial integrity is very important, Mr. President." And some people said, "Oh my God, the Indians have rolled over on the Russians." Well, this isn't strictly accurate, because if you look at what is actually happening, you can see that Modi's comments and the actions of his government reflect really the economic relationships that the Indian ruling class have. Now, if you go and look at the World Bank data, and it's on the World Bank's integrated trade solution part of their website, you can see that the United States is the biggest trading partner of the Indians, followed by the Chinese, followed by the UAE, followed by the Saudis, followed by the Russians. And the Indians actually run heavy trade deficits with an awful lot of these countries. But the United States is one where they run a big trade surplus with. The only other countries they run a big trade surplus with are the Netherlands and the British and the Brazilians and the Italians as well. So this is a big and important trading partner for Indian capitalism. And the actual reality of it is that the Indians aren't going to risk turning their back on that anytime soon. What they are doing, though, is, of course, as the size of their economy increases, they are now the number 5 economy in the world, is that they are striking more of a balance. They're making an awful lot of money out of the trade with the Russian Federation, and so why on earth would they turn their back on that, particularly out of buying and relabeling Russian oil as Indian oil, then selling it at a much higher price? Makes an awful lot of money for the Indian oil industry doing that. But of course, they want to, tell the old man Biden what he wants to hear. So Modi says to him, "Oh, don't worry, Joe. We're with you all the way. In Ukrainian territorial integrity, very important, Joe. Yes, I completely agree. Next, please." So that's how to analyze it. If you look at the developing economic relationships of any country, you can see why they're making the decisions that they are. And of course, the decisions made by the Indian ruling class reflect their interests, and the decisions made by Modi reflect the Indian ruling class. And this doesn't mean that Modi has become some bold, heroic, progressive fighter or anything like that. He's a capitalist politician reflecting the priorities of the Indian bourgeoisie, which are to try and retain a positive relationship with the Americans on the one hand, but continue to build up their relationship with the BRICS countries on the other. And until things change around and the importance of the American trading relationship declines, that's a balance they're going to continue to try and strike. And of course, the US also needs the Indians to make its actions inside the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean look slightly legitimate and not just like a recreation of the old British Empire. So this is a case where you follow the economic interests of a ruling class, and you can see why a particular course of action is being taken. Without profit, can an economy grow? Yes. Okay, Chris, that map of North Korea at night, that's a fake one. That's been doing the rounds for years now. So that's standard like fakery. The DPRK has a fully networked grid. It's not fully dark at night, mate. Okay? Seriously. Just look into it further yourself, and then we're going to be doing more streams on this and come back with more questions. So, is there a risk of another colour revolution in Belarus? Asked TD Mallard. I would say there's always a risk of it. Certainly the US imperialists and the Europeans would love there to be an overthrow of Lukashenko. I think that's declined in terms of risk over the last couple of years since the Russians fully committed to making the Union State Treaty more real, and of course the stationing of a large number of Russian Federation armed forces there makes any military intervention from the Poles or the Baltic yapping dogs much less likely. So it's a risk, but I wouldn't say it's a particularly large one for now. The 2020 events were about as good as they could manage, and now that you've got all those Russian military assets sat there, it makes any action on behalf of the Belarusian opposition even less likely to succeed. Farshid Vahadian says, hello, thanks for the program. Do you see some unhealthy overemphasis on the nationalistic slogan in the Russian Federation Communist Party policy? This is a very interesting question, and it's one which I've considered, and through reading a lot of the Russian Federation, Communist Party of the Russian Federation material, they do emphasize a certain amount of Russian national history, and what they want to do is, and Zyuganov says this in his most recent publication of the Communist Party's program relating to the war in Ukraine, what they are doing is they're taking some elements from the old Soviet Union, particularly the Brezhnev period, and some elements going back to the Stalin period, where they looked at Russian history and sought to position the Soviet state as the inheritor of all the positive elements of Russian history and the Russian resistance to domination by foreign powers. So it was fairly standard in the 40s to see in the Soviet propaganda the claim that they were descended from Alexander Nevsky and through Suvorov and Kutuzov, and the resistance against Napoleon, the defeat of the Swedish army in the 18th century. And of course, all of this is brought to bear in propaganda, saying this is another cause to rally the people to defend the state against. And Zyuganov, in a lot of what he says, emphasizes the point of view that the Russian Communist Party seeks to, if they were to obtain power, embody all the progressive elements in Russian history, and that this is the nationalism that they represent is the nationalism of the Soviet period of representing the progressive elements in Russian history. And of course, it also must be said that Zyuganov and the CPRF reject a lot of the most negative and reactionary elements of Russian history, and quite rightly so. So Zyuganov's accused a lot of embodying too much Russian nationalism. I mean, there are things in the program that I don't agree with. I don't think it's particularly helpful at certain moments to emphasize that the Soviet Union was part of a continuous Russian state that existed for 1,000 years. That was a claim that Brezhnev and Gorbachev made, and I don't see that as being very helpful. I can see why they do it, but I don't think it's particularly positive. I think the good side is to say that communists seek to represent all the progressive traditions, all the best that is within a nation and a national tradition. That's positive to say. Saying that you're the continuation of a 1,000-year-long state, that creates problems. I believe that created certain problems in the latter period of the Soviet Union, when various different elements of petty bourgeois nationalism were encouraged inside the Russian SFSR and in Ukraine and in all the other countries. You got the growth in petty nationalism that was encouraged by the revisionist policies of the Khrushchev and Brezhnev period, which was often found echoes in the intelligentsia. If you look at like what happened in Georgia, some of the key nationalist politicians there in the early period of the late 80s, early 90s all came out of like Georgian literature and poetry circles, because Georgian petty bourgeois nationalism had regrown there and had actually been encouraged to a certain degree in the Brezhnev period. So I can see where this comes from, but it's a part of the program of the CPRF which I don't think is particularly helpful. Again, as I said, emphasizing that you want to continue and embody the most progressive bits of the legacy of the nation, that's fine. But I think that what the CPRF has done sometimes is lean too far into certain types of Russian nationalism. And I don't think that that's helpful. I think their analysis on the Ukraine question has been almost completely correct. But again, like, this all comes from bad decisions made by the revisionists in the Soviet period. and it didn't lead to good consequences then. So I hope that they revise this. I also don't think that their attempt at a rapprochement with the Orthodox Church is a particularly positive thing either. But that came from the Brezhnev period. And Zyuganov is a sort of Brezhnev era official. Now, he's a genuine communist. He's not a miserable capitulator like Gorbachev and co. But he embodies a certain period in the Soviet Party, like in the 70s and early 80s, where a lot of compromises to bourgeois and petty bourgeois trends were made, and it did not lead to good results. So I hope that answers your question. So what else have we got here? Have you read Bra's Socialism with Chinese Characteristics? Any thoughts? Yes, I have read Harpal Bra's Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. I've finished it quite recently. I would recommend it to anybody. I think it's the best analysis of the Chinese system out there. I think it's a properly dialectical analysis. I think it delves deeply into the complicated legacies of the Cultural Revolution and how that produced a lot of contradictory things, and how it was overall, though, a positive thing. And I think that the fundamental point which he concludes on is correct, which is that although the PRC has undeniably achieved an awful lot, the question of the state and market dilemma, the state planning, planned economy versus market relations, and not only that, the contradictions unleashed by commodity production, capitalist commodity production in China, that's something which has gone, it needs to be resolved. It's a contradiction that will need to be resolved in the end. Because even though they've achieved an awful lot of success, it has come at a cost of reintroducing certain elements of capitalism that corrode the socialist system, that create different values in the population. Now, currently, the CPC has clearly several different factions within it. There is a openly pro-capitalist faction, that's clear, that consists of capitalists themselves, who are, of course, allowed into the party since the Yang Zemin era. And you get also a revolutionary wing and a fair amount in the middle as well. And if you read the works of Xi Jinping, you can see these divisions reflected in a lot of what he writes and says, because unlike the idiotic conclusions drawn by Joe Biden and his friends, Xi, and no Chinese leader, is simply a dictator. They are the general secretary of, all these people have been the general secretary of the Communist Party of China, and Xi reflects the line of the party, which contains within it various different strands of thought, which include, of course, the pro-market, pro-capitalist wing, but on the other side, of course, you get the pro-planned economy revolutionary wing, which seeks to restore more economic planning and control to the running of the state. And you see this by, on the one hand, in a lot of Xi's speeches and writings, you see on the one hand he says the only way towards achieving a moderately prosperous society is through more reform and opening up, more pro-capitalist reforms such as those pioneered by Deng Xiaoping on the one hand, and then in the same speech sometimes he'll say, and this is why we need to bolster the party, to reinvigorate our Marxism, to make sure all of our cadres are trained and understand the class struggle and understand the nature of a state of all the people, being a state that is mainly that is for the workers and the peasants. And you see all the different contradictory strands of the party and of the recent history of the party and the state embodied in a lot of what the writings of Xi represent. And this is why I would encourage everybody to read Xi Jinping's work, because you can see in it the divisions that are in play. Now, what I would say is that even though under the Xi era, you see a greater emphasis on the party and the development of party cadre, the strengthening of party branches in workplaces, all of which is positive, and at least a verbal emphasis on reinvigorating the Marxism of the party, all of which is positive, together with their study of the collapse of the USSR, and that's an interesting thing to talk about that I could do an hour on all by itself. But the point I would make is, and this is the point from Bra's book, that every good thing that Xi announces with regard to the reorganization of the party, the reinvigoration of the Chinese party's Marxism on the one hand, you then get the contradictory effect of the increased emphasis on, oh, we need more reform, we need more pro-market reform and opening up on the other. So the positive side and the negative side are constantly pulling in different directions. Eventually, these contradictions that have been built up during the pro-market reform period are going to need to be resolved. And I would hope that they would be resolved by the revolutionary wing of the party gaining more influence over the party and the state and resolving the contradiction comprehensively in favor of the full implementation of a planned economy again. Because the way in which the American imperialists can exercise influence within China is not just through direct economic relations, but through the ideology that the restoration of capitalist relations of production inside China, through the ideology that creates and the contradictions that creates, that is what opens up further opportunities for American imperialism to exploit. So yes, I would recommend anybody read the book Socialism with Chinese Characteristics by Harpal Bra. It's a really good run through of the market reform period and the revolutionary period, very thoroughly researched as well. So the other things that I wanted to just go into were, of course, just to announce some changes to how things are being done. So we've got, for instance, coming up in the next few days, going to be doing a program on Stalin's anarchism or socialism. So be sure to tune in for that one. And what this is going to be from now on is I'm going to be doing these daily updates on YouTube, and then you can find the audio versions on Patreon. And so I'll be back for another one of these tomorrow. One more question before we go. Chris asks, what do you think of Dugin? Dugin is an idealist philosopher. He's credited as a Eurasianist. He was behind the National Bolshevik Party for a while with Eduard Limonov. I haven't actually finished any of his books yet. I did make a start on the fourth political theory. So what I will commit to doing there, Chris, is that when I've finished the fourth political theory, I will come back to you with an answer. I think he has some influence within the ruling circles in the Russian Federation, but I don't think that he is the Putin's brain, as the reactionary press in Britain would have everybody believe. So I'll come back with a definitive answer on Dugin when I've actually finished his book, because I don't want to go into broad sweeping statements about him before I've actually finished some of his literature. But I've hit the 50th minute mark, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock it on the head there. Be back again with more on this tomorrow. So until then, thank you to everybody for the questions, and be sure to bring plenty of those back to the session tomorrow. It's always good to have these be as interactive as possible. And I'll aim to do something about the volume on the stream as well. But until tomorrow, thank you for tuning in, and